Okay, let's see if we can tackle the psychology of groups like these. On the surface, a group that is hateful towards, say, Jews and non-whites is perceived to be exactly what it appears to be, racist and jingoistic. But I suspect there must be more to it than just that.
I don't believe the ideology itself is the great attractor. It's certainly a part of it. I think there's deeper psychological motives that get fulfilled, deeper psychological needs that get fulfilled through the vehicle of the ideology, and it really doesn't matter what the ideology is in that regard. So, the University of Maryland did in their studies of terrorism and responses to terrorism. Did a study a little while back, and they found that the number one correlated factor in the history of someone joining a violent extremist group is childhood trauma. And so what is it about childhood trauma? And they were talking physical and sexual abuse. And you can have trauma without a physical component. You can have emotional trauma, which I think is the byproduct of physical trauma, the lasting byproduct of physical trauma. And what is it what does emotional trauma do psychologically? And I think what emotional trauma does is it impairs the sense of self. And I call it, I'm not the first to call it this, but toxic shame. And toxic shame is an impaired sense of self, and it sits in the real deep subconscious self-identity belief system. And people feel that they're flawed, they're not good enough, they're not lovable, they're not smart enough, they're weak, they're powerless, they're ugly, they're whatever. That's what they believe about themselves, and I think that's what the trauma does. And when somebody said to me, like, well, that person, they just hate themselves, and I thought, like, I never hated myself, and when you think about hate in sort of the conscious way, but really once I sort of peeled back the layers of understanding to my own psychology, there absolutely was a self-loathing. There was the belief that I was unlovable. There was the belief that I was powerless and I was weak, and so I gravitated to a youth subculture that give me the feeling of powerful. And one thing that this movement gave me was I got attention when I felt invisible, I got acceptance when I felt unlovable, and I got power when I felt powerless. The illusion of power. And so that's the sort of the dynamic of toxic shame, and I think it's these voids, these vulnerabilities that people carry, and when they come across these types of movements, and the people in these movements, without really understanding what they're doing, they know how to exploit these vulnerabilities. You need those vulnerabilities. If you take the ideology and give it to a very psychologically healthy, well-adjusted individual, it doesn't make any sense. There's no draw. But when you get the sense of brotherhood and the sense of camaraderie and the sense of joining something greater than yourself, a sense of purpose and meaning, if you don't have those things, it's like you've just found the greatest thing in the world. And I could have been captain of the football team, but I wasn't a jock. So that you can get these things in a healthy way. But in the absence of finding them in a healthy way, we will find them in an unhealthy way. And to that sort of extent, I think there's also a bit of serendipity that comes involved. You just meet the wrong person at the wrong time, and you get introduced to a world that just feels right. It just feels, good in the place to be, and you're getting these deeper psychological needs met. When we have these deficiencies, that when we have this toxic shame, we as human beings, we spend our inordinate amount of time trying to prove to the world that the lie is not true. So someone who feels less than might go on to become an overachiever, prove to the world that they're greater than. We've all met, people at school that got straight A's and everything, played 4 instruments, 3 languages, and captained the rugby team. That's actually coming. It's not a healthy way to be, although it's productive. But that's coming from this feeling of not being good enough, so that they have to prove the lie wrong. And I certainly, there was aspects of my life where I did that. Also, there was aspects of our life, another thing we do with toxic shame is prove the lie right. And I was sort of a gifted underachiever at times as well. But we're always trying to sort of toxic shame is the dirty secret we try to keep from the world, and it's the dirty secret we keep from ourselves. And so there's 2 things we do with that toxic shame. The first thing is we project it onto other people. So violence, and there's many forms of violence that don't involve physical contact. Passive aggressive violence, humiliating people, verbal abuse, psychological, emotional abuse, but gangs, extremist groups. Murder is the ultimate expression of externalized shame. Or we internalize it, we hide it from ourselves, and we do things like substance abuse, cutting, eating disorders, risky sexual behavior, playing a sport where we break a bone every 3 weeks or whatever. There's different ways in which we will internalize the shame, and suicide is the ultimate expression of internalized shame. And Dr. James Gilligan wrote a book, Violence Study, Reflections on a National Epidemic. And he was a prison psychiatrist. I think it was San Quentin or something like that in California. And, in his 20 years that he was there, sort of never sort of saw an act of violence that wasn't rooted in shame and humiliation. And he says in his book, all violence is an attempt to convert shame into self-esteem. And when I talk about shame, I just want to be clear here. There's healthy shame, that the feeling you get when you've done something wrong or you've harmed somebody you didn't mean to, and that's a healthy shame. And it's what denotes healthy emotions is a transitory. You feel them and then they go away. So healthy shame is I did bad, I did wrong. Toxic shame is I am bad, I am wrong, and it's a permanent piece, and that's what really makes it unhealthy. On the internalized shame piece, great book on understanding it is Healing the Shame That Binds Us by Dr. John Bradshaw. And he was an addictions specialist, and he wrote, shame is the root of all addiction. So it really plays a pernicious role in young people. And I think, we all have some sense of shame. I think it's part of the human condition. And some people adapt to it and get over it and move through it easier than others. And I adopted an ideology that told me I was greater than to compensate for my feeling of less than. And I adopted an ideology that gave me an ideological framework to justify the violence and justify the rage that I was wanting to put onto other people. And I truly believe that the level to which we dehumanize other human beings is a mirror reflection of our own internal disconnection and dehumanization. So when I see the guys with shields and clubs and stuff at Charlottesville, I see a wounded 4-year-old having a temper tantrum in a grown man's body, And as disarming as that may sound, I'm also very well aware of the fact that there's probably nothing more dangerous than a wounded 4-year-old having a temper tantrum in an adult man's body.
Well, Tony, eventually you decided to leave the group. So why did you decide to leave it? And what was it like for you in the weeks and months afterwards?
It was sort of a gradual leaving. And, you know, one of the difficult things in leaving is it wasn't just what I believed. It was who I was. And identity and ideology became intertwined. And so that's why it's difficult to sort of intellectually dissuade someone from being a part of these movements, because the second you do that, you're not attacking their ideology, you're attacking their identity. And the ego will fight to the death to survive, to keep itself in what it believes to be true. So, I mean, I was going through a fair share of disillusionment, but really what changed things for me was the birth of my daughter. And I was, I think, 23 at the time, and in the delivery room, and I'm holding this beautiful little baby girl, and she's, you know, tiny, and I'm terrified I'm going to do something wrong, and so delicate and so you know, wonderful. And then she's given it that little face, and she opens her eyes for the first time, and my face is the first blurry picture her brain's going to take. And for the first time since I couldn't remember when, I connected to another human being. And for the first time since I couldn't remember when, I made decisions for someone else besides myself. And, you know, as she grew up, and 18 months later or 15 months later, I had a son. And with him, I got to parent him the way that I always wanted to be parented. And so, you know, growing up, I had all the soccer games. I had so much time and attention. You know, I did the opposite. You know, here's a good thing for your audience to consider. I would look at all of your behaviors and beliefs and ask yourself this question: is it the same as one of my parents? Is it the opposite of one of my parents? Or is it actually mine? And so that was sort of a cathartic way that I was healing with these children. And the amazing thing about children is, you know, as their dad, they see this magnificent human being that's awesome and wonderful, and that's not who I see when I look in the mirror. And what I got to see through the eyes of my children reflected back at me was my own humanity, because I was completely disconnected from my humanity. I was operating solely from ego and intellect, and that's a dangerous thing, with zero connection to my heart. I'd had a connection to my heart, but I'd put on armor, wore masks, and projected myself to be someone that I wasn't, and stuffed my feelings down inside until I couldn't feel them anymore. And, you know, if you'd have met me back then, I probably would have presented as a narcissist. So that was my first taste of compassion, and that when we're compassionate with a human being, we basically, in effect, hold a mirror up and allow them to see their humanity reflected back at them. When we treat them with humanity, when we recognize the humanity in the individual, that the individual can't help but to take some of that on. And that was my first sort of taste in compassion. But I still had, you know, the identity and the expectations, and, you know, and leadership, and when they were 2 and 4, I became a single father. I had them most days of the week, and by 4 and 6, I had them full time. And this is in the 90s, where single dads were like unicorns. And I started to get attention, acceptance, approval for being a single dad. And so as that identity of single dad sort of arose, it became easier to transition from one identity to the other. but my ego wouldn't let go of the ideology and the beliefs. And so I rationalized to myself, like, screw this movement. Why should I fight for a bunch of white people who couldn't care whether I lived or died? If I really want to do something for the white race, I'll make sure these 2 children thrive and survive. And that was how I rationalized to myself leaving the movement, but keeping my identity intact. But once I'd separated myself from the movement, and I kind of did fade to black. I didn't say, hey, you guys are a bunch of idiots, I'm out of here. I just was taking care of my family. I need a break. I've done so much, and had a lot of respect. So people just sort of, let me drift away, and I just didn't answer the phone as much and that kind of thing. And so those psychic bonds to that started to fade, and I started to build new friendships, and it was a really difficult period of my life. And in the book I talk about the void, and so imagine leaving an entire social circle behind, the parties, the activities, the friendships, all of those things, and have yet to fully reconstitute a new identity with which to attract a new social circle. And so there's this period in the middle that I call the void, where you don't have a social circle. And it's sort of necessary to traverse that void to get to the other side. We have to let go of the one side in order to be able to attract people on the other side. I think I've watched people try and keep one foot on each shore, and it doesn't work. But luckily, I had my children, so I wasn't completely alone. But at Life After Hate, they created a whole online social circle of people that have either gone through the void or are in the void, so it doesn't have to be a solo journey. But that was the difficult part in leaving. And even though I'd left, I hadn't dealt with any of the wounds, any of the vulnerabilities that made joining the movement attractive in the first place. And I just want to be very clear here. I don't blame anything that I did on anything that happened in my childhood. Everything I did, I chose to do. And what I'm sharing, why I tell you about my childhood, so you can understand the lens through which I made my choices. And it's not for the purposes of excusing what I did. It's for the purposes of understanding. I always have to make that clear. I take a personal responsibility, and I do the work I do as my way of atoning for the harm that I put into the world. The second lesson I got on compassion, and compassion plays a really key role, is my mother, who I was estranged from the rest of my family, but my mom never gave up on me. Her love for me was unconditional, but her relationship with me was very conditional. And as I was, struggling to, be a full-time single dad, I needed her help to raise these 2 children. And as long as I was involved in those movements, she wasn't going to help me. So it made that choice to leave even greater, and sort of prevented me from ever going back, in my loneliest of moments. And that taught me a second great lesson about compassion, and that it's a really powerful tool when it's accompanied with healthy boundaries and consequences. Third piece, because I still had not dealt with any of my wounds, is I left in 98, 2004. I started a career as a financial advisor, and sort of a rebuilding and even a new business identity, for myself. And I was hiding from my past at this point. I didn't tell anybody about it. When people found out, it tended to mean the end of the friendship, the end of that social circle. And I started doing personal growth and workshops, to have more success and to live the life of your dreams and all that kind of stuff that gets you in the front door. And as I went through these workshops, the guy who taught them, he was from Manchester, I'm originally from Liverpool, and he was about 10 years older, and we bonded over Monty Python, Benny Hill, and 80s British music, and he was a really funny guy and the English sense of humor, and so we sort of hit it off like a house on fire, and developed a good friendship as I'm going through these programs, and my life is starting to change in wonderful ways, and my children's lives are getting better, and so I'm sort of all in on this, and after about 8 months I've done all the programs, and my friend that had introduced us hands me an envelope, for my birthday. It's my birthday present. So I open up the envelope and I pull out this gift certificate, and it's a gift certificate for one-on-one counseling with this guy. I went, great. Who doesn't want therapy for their birthday? Best birthday present ever. And so I go to this first therapy session. I've never been in therapy before, and counseling. And I start to tell them, all the reasons why I'm angry at my dad, and the things that happen in my life, and I'm still viewing myself as a victim and blaming others, and I think about, do I tell them the rest? Do I tell them about being a skinhead and neo-Nazis and Aryan nations and Holocaust denial and all of that? And I was terrified of losing this relationship. So I know I was, staring at one piece of the carpet on the floor and hoping it would give me some idea of what I should do. And when that spot didn't work, I stared at another part of the carpet, and to no avail. And Dov says to me, he says, look, mate, whatever you want to tell me, just let it out. I mean, we've already sort of wasted 15 minutes here. Let's whatever it is, let's talk about it. And I said, I don't know. And he said, look, mate, it's safe. You look like you're trying to swallow 3 golf balls. Just let it out. It's okay, I promise. And I said, to hell with it. And out it came, and I gave him the Reader's Digest of all the stuff that I'd been involved with. And the more I tell him, the more he smiles. And the more he smiles, the more I get annoyed. And I'm like, here I am, bearing my soul in my first therapy. And here the guy's like laughing at me, like, what's so funny? And he leans in with a huge grin on his face, and he says, I'm Jewish, right? And I'm like, of course. Of course. And, here's this man who loves me, wants to heal me, wants to heal my family and my children. And as a friend I respect, and a relationship I value. And here I am sinking into my chair, my cheeks flushed with shame, knowing that I once advocated for the annihilation of him and his people. And that taught me one of the most important lessons around compassion is receiving compassion from someone who we don't feel we deserve it from, particularly someone that we've dehumanized, is an incredibly powerful tool. And I just want to add a caveat to that. I'm not suggesting for a moment that it's the responsibility of people of color to go and hug a Nazi or whatever, but know that gift is an extremely powerful gift should you choose to give it. And so compassion, and when I talking earlier about toxic shame, what is the antidote to toxic shame? It's compassion. When the problem is we feel less than, through compassion we can help a person feel whole again. So radical compassion is the and it's a major theme in the book about getting back to that feeling of wholeness.
Right. Well, you've written a book, as you've said, The Cure for Hate, a former white supremacist journey from violent extremism to radical compassion. Tony, who is this book aimed for, and why is it different from other books out there telling a similar story?
Well, I think most other books, by the time you get to them leaving the movement, it's sort of near the end of the book. For me, leaving the movement happens about the middle of the book, and really leaving the movement is just the beginning. It's the journey of healing. It's the journey of atonement, going back to communities that I'd once harmed, and engaging in healing with those communities that both healed myself and healed them. There's so much more than just, leaving the movement. Oh great, you stop being an asshole, good for you. There's a lot more work that has to be done, and my life is dedicated to continuing to do this work and to help others in the healing process. So it's written for a couple different audiences. So like I said, with about 1,000 hours of one-on-one and group counseling, as I write the book and I'm describing things, sometimes I take a step back and discuss the psychology behind why I was making those decisions, what I was getting out of it, what need was it, psychological deep need was it fulfilling. So I think understanding and humanizing how people get drawn into these movements, and not just they're thug monsters or whatever. They're nobody comes into the world as a neo-Nazi. We may all come into the world as skinheads, but for your audience, think back to the time when they were 3 or 4, and think back to the sort of core essence of who they were. And if I think back to little Tony, it was this curious, mischievous, stubborn, defiant, sensitive little boy, open to the world and sort of full of fun and laughter. And then life happens to us. And it's not safe to be sensitive, or maybe it's not safe to be who we are. And so we stop being who we are, and we put on masks, and we put on shields and project ourselves to be something we're not in order to feel safe. That's a story that I've heard. It's a theme that runs through a lot of stories of people that I've helped and that I've heard through research and stuff like that. So there's the part that's for understanding. I think there's the back half of the book is got some ideas on solutions for community, certainly for parents who are concerned about a loved one or any family member. I think it's a good read. It's written almost like a case study for academics as well, and it's I hope that the book helps people get to a place of compassion, not just for themselves, but for all people. And that's sort of my personal mission statement, is to inspire people to a place of compassion for themselves and for all people, and to promote the notion of radical compassion. And what is radical compassion? And I think the world is in dire need of radical compassion. And the first step in radical compassion is your practice of compassion must take you outside your comfort zone. I think the solutions to many of the division and hatred in society is not going to be solved from inside our comfort zone. Number 2, the practice of compassion should have a social activist element. And what I mean by that is it's not just enough to alleviate the suffering of another human being. We should also take action to change the environment which gives rise to or supports the suffering. So social activist component to it. And the third one, and I think it's one of the most radical things a human being can do, is the journey inward, and to develop self-compassion. Because if we have compassion for other people, that's about ego. That's about being seen to be compassionate. When we have compassion for ourselves and nobody else, that's narcissism. So the two have to be held in balance. And what I've learned is the more that I did the journey inwards, and the journey of healing and the journey of self-acceptance and that journey of self-compassion, the more I did that, the more it exponentially grew my capacity to give compassion to the world. And I think that's a very important thing. We don't do that journey inwards, we severely limit our capacity for compassion. And what I've learned is, I spent 15 years trying to change the world outside of me to sort of solve the problems that were going on inside of me. And what I found is by going inside of me and working on those problems inside of me, I have far more capacity to change the world. And so I believe that when we heal ourselves, we heal the world. And if you want to change the world, It starts in here, and that's probably one of the most radical journeys a human being can take. And I think but it's a noble one, and it's one that you want to change the world, you change who we are in the world. And
Absolutely.
And it's not about changing what's out there. It's about changing what's in here.
Well, this has been an extremely intense journey for you, Tony, and I definitely want to congratulate you for having the strength of will to not only exit the group, but also for all the hard work you do every single day to help others to leave and heal from hateful, destructive organizations. I will leave links below to your book, as well as the websites Life After Hate and the Forgiveness Project. But before we go, if anyone is watching this right now who is perhaps still inside a white supremacist group or any group that encourages hate and perhaps wants to leave but doesn't quite know what to do, what would you say to them right now?
Reach out. You don't have to. There is a way out. There's a way out, and you can rejoin your place in humanity, and you don't have to stay. We can help you walk. There's organizations in the UK that can help you leave. There's organizations in the United States that can help you leave. But reach out, throw me an email. I'd love to talk to you and help you if I can. And if you're a parent struggling with a young one, I'd love to talk to you, as well as to help you help your loved one without making the situation worse, because it's very easy to make it worse.
Tony McAleer, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.